we're back, and of course we are starting our first conversation for this morning. We are joined by professional counselor Aimee Jex. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
And Aimee, we thank you for being here this morning as we try to collectively regroup and put things into perspective following the tragedy that occurred at the end of last week. So thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me. Like you said, it's a very important topic, and it really touches all of us. It really brings up a lot of things, and as I've mentioned before, a topic like this, it's important to keep it in the zeitgeist. It's important to keep talking about it, because by talking about it, we challenge those norms that we don't want. We can be able to change and to spot the differences and to say, you know, this isn't right. Let's try to move in this direction.
Yeah. You know, I think the overarching issue right now is looking at what was done to this particular child, but to broaden it, it's being able to understand that there are many children in this country who suffer from child abuse. But you know, tapping into your own profession, would you say that the entire country and people who've been exposed to this story, that we have all on some level experienced the trauma of this incident?
These issues do traumatize us as a society, as a group. As I believe you mentioned slightly, but there are people who are calling out for vigilante justice because they feel that it's what they can do. And that's what it's calling us to do. It's asking us to say, we need to react, we need to do something. And in our reaction, it kind of becomes ingrained that we need to do something personally. So we can't just leave it to other people or step back. But in that's what I'm saying, we need to start making wider changes in our entire society. Yeah. So yes, there is that individual trauma that comes to us because of these types of things. Yeah. We are in a society where at this point we have not experienced war, but we do have that violence, the gang violence. We have the unreliability of certain things. We do live with certain things in our society that cause us to change how we think, and we come to accept certain things that maybe we should not. So in something like this, we say and we talk to ourselves, where is my responsibility? We start talking about these things that are affecting us, and they change how we interact with each other. Could you imagine that? As the grandmother in your news piece mentioned, she saw things but did not speak out. So that is something that she is living with, and it's something that she's been talking about, you know. And so these are the things where we do live with certain signs and certain things that we feel that we should not, but we don't have an outlet for it.
We were discussing just a bit, and one of the things that we want to that you said you wanted to discuss was looking at the cultural norms that's kind of developed in the country. And a lot of it has to do with abuse. In fact, in 16 Days of Activism, we always hear kind of naysayers coming out and criticizing the fact that not enough is done, but not really realizing that this isn't a them and us construct. It really is everybody. So yes. Can we move into that?
Yes, I believe the last time I was on Open Your Eyes was for the launch of the 16 Days of Activism. And you know, it is a really important conversation that was started, and in these cases, it's unfortunate, but this is a continuation of that conversation. When we talk about violence in our community, in our society, these are exactly the things we are talking about. As you had mentioned in the news piece as well, there were already signs of that abuse within the relationship. Yeah. And that is one of the main indicators that we see would carry on into the abuse of the children. So if you are in a relationship that is not balanced, you don't have equality, where there is a power issue, where there is a control issue, that's one of the main things that will trigger these kinds of incidents where the children might get abused. Yeah. Because in that, you have an expectation that as maybe the perpetrator, you have an expectation of everything being done toward what you want. Yeah. So if things don't go to where you want it to be, then you have a loss of control, right? So when we have these conversations, it's important to note that you have to learn to emotionally regulate, and that's something that in our culture, in our society, we do not have a priority on that. When you have a child who has a tantrum, you spank the child and you inflict even more violence upon the child. So the child learns that when there is something I don't like, violence comes of it. So I don't learn to express myself. I don't learn to regulate my emotions. I just learn that I will be beat until I'm quiet. So when I learn to want to get someone else to be silent or to not do what I don't want, I will just beat it out of them. You know, so that is one of the basic things that we look about. We have a culture of violence. We just have violence in all levels. We scream at our employees, we scream at our students, we scream at our children, and we expect something different to come from that. But if that's the only thing we see, that's what will happen. That's what I will do, because that's what I will see. We have loud households. We have households where there is beating. We have these things, and it's not that they are bad parenting versus good parenting. It's when you look at it, am I getting the opportunity to rationalize and have an opinion as to why I should stop this behavior? Or do I just shut up because I don't have a chance? Again, this is where we have this power. So at the first opportunity that I can get power, so I am 10, 11 years old, and I have been beaten my entire life. But when I get that growth spurt at 13, then I get stronger than you, and you can't beat me, so I start hitting you. Because that's what we do in our home. We hit each other, we scream at each other, and the bigger person will be the one who can inflict a bit more.
Let me ask this, and perhaps I'm digressing a bit here. I want to go back to the question that was posed in the morning tea. How much access does, I want to be politically correct by Marlene's standards, so you'll forgive the question. How much access does an individual in a relationship situation, who may not necessarily be the biological parent of the child or children, should have? In your opinion, or perhaps from a professional point of view, how do you measure how close or how distant, or do you discipline, or do you leave that for someone else to deal with? How does that dynamic work?
Well, that is a tricky situation because it depends on the relationship, right? But when we look at the signs, some of the things that I was preparing was when one thing you mentioned earlier was when the relationship starts getting intense too quickly, that is a bad sign for the relationship. So if you don't allow yourself to get to know your partner before introducing your partner to your children, that's not a good thing. So you have to be confident in how well you know your partner before you can introduce your partner to your children. Let's say, for example, that you started this relationship and maybe it evolved a little bit more quickly, but you have gotten to interact with your partner, and you know that your partner is also a parent, and you know from other people that your partner is a good parent. Maybe you have less trouble introducing your children to that person. But in that, again, we go back to equality. Your partner will not overstep bounds either. You will have conversations. We see that with stepfathers. We see that with stepmothers as well. If you have that mutual respect with your partner, you will understand, you know what, your child said something inappropriate, how do we deal with this? And we have a conversation about it, rather than why you lash my picnic. You know, it's not starting there. So it has to do a lot more going back to the nature of the relationship, how quickly it's evolving, and the level of respect within that relationship. So it's not we can go after a month, you can come into my children's lives and discipline them, or we've been married for 15 years and you cannot discipline my child. So it really depends on the relationship and how well the communication is within that relationship, and also the level of respect within it.
Because this is actually one of the fundamentals in child abuse prevention, which is knowing who your children are exposed to. And so if I'm dating someone and I know them 4 or 5 months, how much do I really know them enough to expose my children to them? And so I want, that's a great way to kind of talk about how you can prevent child abuse from your own children, because so often abuse happens, physical and sexual, by people who are close to the kids.
You know, majority, up to 90% of all abuse, physical and sexual, is perpetrated by someone who the child knows and interacts with on a regular basis. So when we talk about who has access to your child, as a parent, it's not just the partner that you're concerned with, but who's your babysitter, who are the teachers at the school. And so as a parent, you need to know the people who are around your children. You need to know that these people are people who will talk to you and say, you know, your child is not doing this, or your child is doing this behavior. Because we look at children as, well, we're evolving. We have some of us who see children as thinking individuals, and they will learn and we will speak to them, but we still have those ideas that children are still to be seen and not heard. We do have those people in our society still who believe that a child should not have an opinion, should not speak. But the earlier you start having children share and learn things, the easier it is for them to advocate for themselves. When we talk about abuse, we often talk about vulnerable populations. So when we talk about child abuse, we see children as vulnerable populations. So when we talk about children, we're going to have them empower themselves. We need to teach them what is appropriate. And that's where parenting comes in. That's where we need to teach the children themselves. You have to respect this about yourself. If someone does this to you, you have to come back with this. We have to have that conversation where we're talking not just about friendships, but about sexuality at earlier ages, so children can know what is right and what is not right. So if I'm a parent and I don't have time, or I don't make the time for these conversations, at what point will I find out if my child is being groomed for something? Because that's what we call it. Sometimes there are abusers and perpetrators who groom children. And that would say, you know, adults who spend time with children in inappropriate manners. Maybe they give gifts for no reason. Maybe they talk to the children about their personal problems. It's like they are talking to children as if the child was an adult. So when we look at those grooming behaviors, we're seeing things that are inappropriate, but they're not really weird. It's just, oh, this person is spending some nice time with the children. When we think about this, we wonder, who do I look out for in this situation? Sometimes it's someone who is a positive person in our lives. It's someone who is charismatic, but we have to start looking at, is this behavior appropriate? Is this at a level where it would be okay for this child to be this close to that person at this point? So again, looking back at time, how quickly this is happening.
I think there's an onus on parents particularly to be vigilant because the child may not know that he or she is being exposed to the dangers of someone who has a motive or an agenda.
Of course.
The child is innocent to that. So the child doesn't know how to detect when someone is doing something because there's a motion, they're trying to get to something. But the parent should have that responsibility, or that innate sense to detect, you know what, you can't get that close, or you know, high and by is enough. Or you know what, that's your grandmother, your grandfather, that is
Or
a bit
even,
more
you
okay or what
know,
have
even,
you.
you know, when the child says, you know, I don't want to go hail uncle, and the parent says, you know, you have to.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are these expectations that we are willing to look past because this is supposed to be what it is. But we really have to listen to what the child says and make sure the child is being comfortable. So when the child comes and says, I don't want to spend time with this person, you have to sit down and ask why, instead of saying, but that's the babysitter, you have to, you know. So, but the child will never come and tell you, I don't feel comfortable around this person, if you don't make the child comfortable enough to come to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So you are right, Isani, in saying that the onus is on the parents, on the grandparents, on the aunts, on the uncles, on the extended family. We all have to look out. Like I mentioned, children are a vulnerable population, similar to the elderly, similar to people with disabilities. And so we have to look at these populations differently. The reason why we have the 16 days of activism is because of the power shifts in the community. Men are more elevated level than women. So to an extent, women are also a vulnerable population. That is why we have those 16 days to empower women to say, you know, you can speak out as well. You can have a little bit more. You have a right to speak out. These are the things that you can do. And give women and give other people that opportunity to say, these are appropriate, these are inappropriate, and speak out when you feel that something is off. And it's not calling 911 or blaming someone. It's learning to understand what feels right and knowing that if your gut feeling is off, what to do about it. Because sometimes we just have that gut feeling and we don't really know what our next step is. But we don't want to get the police involved. We don't want to get the social workers involved because that will take it to another level that maybe I might not be prepared to do at that point. But it is important to be able to say, let me talk to my cousin who knows a lawyer. Let me talk to this person who knows the police. And just have that conversation so that we start learning a bit more.
Yeah. You know, I think that one of the things, and you said, naturally when you see signs, or sometimes you even hear physical abuse taking place, domestic and to partners and to children, and you don't do anything because we feel like we don't want to get involved. But especially in the case of children, there is a mandatory reporting law where if you have reasonable proof to believe that a child is being abused, you should report it. And this is because, as you said so clearly, children are vulnerable and very often incapable of speaking up or defending their own selves. And when the household that they're in no longer ensures that protection, we as neighbors, as people who pass through the community, as people who witness certain things, we have a responsibility to report it as well. And in fact, there's structures in place and laws in place to remind us of that responsibility. So using that as kind of a jumping point, what can I look for? I mean, maybe I just see a adult and a child and it doesn't really look okay to me, but that's not enough to say something is happening. If I come in contact with a child, what are some of the things that I may look for to understand or to recognize that they may be a victim of abuse?
Well, as you know, there are the different signs of abuse. So with physical abuse, it's a lot more easy to recognize. Maybe welts on the skin, you have maybe injuries, broken bones, you may the child may show maybe limping, but that's a first conversation to ask what happened. And if the child has been groomed to say, you know, I fell off the step, or, you know, I am just a clumsy child and I fell, then we already know there that it's going to be difficult to get help for this particular child because this child has been groomed to say, nothing is wrong, I'm all right, it's just something that happened naturally or something. And so the child already is starting to cover up for the abuser in just the physical. When we talk about more sexual abuse, as a therapist, you always look for inappropriate sexual development or sexual signs when it's for a younger age. So someone who speaks about sexual things when it's not appropriate for their age. That's one of the biggest things. So we might look for physical signs of rape, but as a therapist, that's not what I'm specialized. As a teacher, you couldn't do that. As a parent, yes. If you are a medical provider, then the parent would take that person to you and you could see those signs of sexual abuse. But as a neighbor, you want to see more of inappropriate behaviors, sexual things that children at that age should not know, but they do know. Being extra violent could be something else. One of the things I mentioned about a perpetrator could be true to the child as well. Emotional dysregulation, not being able to know how to process feelings or explain feelings, and always being extra aggressive or extra angry. So those are one of the things. When we look at an abuser, very often there is a history of abuse in that abuser's history. So we can't, like you mentioned, there has to be that legal process to this, because we cannot do vigilante justice, because every time I see a case on the news, something that comes up in social media, my first thought as a counselor is, I wonder what is the history of that person. I wonder when that person was abused. I wonder what the background of that person was, that these are the things that are happening to this person. So in many instances, these people who are perpetrators were victims at some point. And that's how they learned the cycle of abusing. That's how they learn the cycle of this is how you express yourself. So that there is that emotional dysregulation. So we talked about sexual, we talked a little bit about physical abuse, but in emotional abuse, you see a lot of stunted emotions. But if we look at our culture, who really, has perfect communication, especially at a young age. So these are things that we definitely need to look at, how you express yourself and different things like that.
I wanted to move beyond just the child abuse, because I think when you mentioned earlier, and I don't want us to move past it, because there are women right now who are watching, who are worrying about their children, but just how common it is that often if you are the victim in a domestic abuse case, if you are being abused in your home, how likely it is that your children may be at risk as well. Because we know stories where women stay in the relationship because the threat is, I'm going to hurt your children. But essentially the fact that you're abused is already a threat to your children, right?
Yes, and you hear that even in marriages. I stay in this relationship because of my children. But we mentioned earlier that we have this community trauma from these types of incidents, right? So imagine if you are being abused domestically. Your children witness that. So they are experiencing trauma from the domestic abuse. Even if the children are not being abused physically or sexually, that is an emotional drain on the children as well, that they are experiencing that you are being hit, that you are expressing yourself like this. So when we see some of these signs, we see that children often learn to scream at their parents because that's the communication that they hear in the home. They learn to curse because that's the communication they hear in their home. So we have all these signs that go back to, if you are in an abusive relationship, your children are seeing it, but statistics show that when the partner is being abused, there is a high likelihood that the children are also being abused physically, perhaps not sexually. That is a little bit different. So sexual abuse is a little bit different. If the mother is being raped or if the partner is being raped, there's not necessarily that sexual abuse toward the children, except in some cases. Again, goes back with the perpetrator. There is a history of abuse. There might have been a history of sexual abuse for that person as well. There might be some substance use. We are looking for maybe other mental health issues where emotional dysregulation might be one of the major indicators of that mental health illness. There might be stress, and we look at parenting as a big issue as well.
You're saying something I think that even goes beyond what I was thinking when I asked the question. So I was thinking that if I'm in a house and my spouse beats me, that someday he may beat my children. And I'm staying because I don't want him to hurt my children, but staying puts them more at risk. But you're highlighting the fact that just them seeing it, or oftentimes hearing it, because people try to hide it, is enough trauma to them.
Of course. And yes, if you grew up, let's say your neighbors were very loud, that affected you. Imagine if it was inside your home, you know. And one of the things you mentioned earlier is that as neighbors, we have an obligation to reach out. But I've heard from many people, I have these neighbors and I call the police to their house several times. And you know what? I called so much that I stopped calling because the police stopped come. You know,
everybody gets tired of dealing with the situation, and there's no change.
But that's a lack of sensitization, because that's why we call it the cycle of domestic abuse.
Exactly, and by having these things, we set up safety plans. We set up options for these people so that they don't feel the obligation to go back. Remember when we talk about domestic abuse, there is that economic aspect of emotional abuse. Sorry, the economic.
Where are you going to go if you leave?
Exactly. And sometimes you would like to go back to your mom's house, but there's already your 2 siblings and all their kids living there. And so there is not that space to go, and you are making a little bit of money, you're maintaining your household, and you cannot afford a rent. As I talk to a lot of people, go ahead.
Yeah, there's sort of like a one-way policy where when you come of age and you venture off into a relationship, if you're living with somebody already, if something happens, you can't come back. You have to stay and battle it out, or you have to fend for yourself otherwise. For some reason, you find that that's prevalent.
It's a very real situation, And so, you know, I said that, and I think that maybe that's one of the ways we can channel the emotions we're feeling right now. Look out to see how we're supporting victims of domestic abuse in the households. Are we reporting? Maybe that one time you didn't call the police because you're tired of calling is the day something tragic happens. And also that we need to have more support systems in place, because if you don't have anywhere to go, if you can't go back to mom's, because you know mom's gonna say, listen, you choose that, you stay there, or I can't take you in, or maybe you're embarrassed. That you do have somewhere else to go as well, and not stay and risk your life or the lives of your children. So this is a part of our processing this morning. We're out of time. Aimee, I know you have a lot more to get into, but that just means that we will keep the conversation going. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for the shot. It was very important to me too.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we will get an update from the Keycocker Belize Tourism Industry Association about the troubles they've been having with utilities on the island. So please stay tuned.